The candle had burned down to its last inch. In the antechamber of a palace, whose name historians would later argue over, a woman was being dressed by hands that were not her own. The fabric was heavy, brocade, stiff with gold thread, and it smelled of cedar oil and something older, something that did not have a pleasant name. Outside, the city was waking. Roosters, cartwheels on stone, the low murmur of soldiers changing their post at the gate. She had been told this morning would be ceremonial. She had been told she would be presented. What she had not been told was that the document transferring her legal guardianship had already been signed the night before, while she slept, in a room she was not permitted to enter. Before the sun reached the top of the outer wall, her name would appear in a ledger she would never read, not as a person, but as a line item. This is the story history tried to close quietly. In a few minutes, you will understand why it was never fully shut. Now, let us go back to the beginning. If you find yourself drawn to histories buried inside official records, consider subscribing. There is more where this came from. To understand how women became liabilities, you first have to understand how they were made into assets. In the political architecture of pre-modern states, whether we are speaking of dynastic China, medieval Europe, the Ottoman court, or the imperial networks of South and Southeast Asia, a ruler's power was never purely military. It was relational. It was woven together through marriages, through bloodlines confirmed and bloodlines denied, through the careful arrangement of bodies across borders. A daughter sent east meant a treaty held. A sister offered to a rival meant a season without war. The woman herself was rarely the point. She was the medium through which two men communicated something they could not say directly. This is not a metaphor. Diplomatic correspondence from the courts of the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries describes the movement of noblewomen in the same language used to describe the movement of grain and artillery. The records are tidy. They are almost boring in their tidiness. A woman's age, her reported health, the condition of her teeth, her capacity to bear children. These appear in ambassadorial reports alongside notes about road conditions and the exchange rate of silver. She was a variable in someone else's equation. She was also a person who spoke, who observed, who remembered. She entered foreign courts as a stranger. She learned the language, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes with a fluency that startled her hosts. She built relationships. She corresponded with her family of origin. She prayed to a god her new household sometimes did not share. She existed inside the machine, but she was not the machine. That gap, the gap between what she was supposed to be and what she actually was, is where the danger lived. And the door between those two versions of her was always open. Until one day, it was not. The danger did not usually arrive all at once. It arrived the way cold arrives in autumn, gradually, then undeniably. First, a shift in tone. The letters from home arrived less frequently, or arrived already opened, the wax resealed with a different seal. Then came a change in the composition of her household staff. A lady-in-waiting she had trusted for years was reassigned, quietly, without explanation. A new attendant appeared, younger, with eyes that moved quickly and a memory that seemed unusually precise. The woman may have noticed. Many of them did notice. But noticing and speaking were not the same thing, and speaking carried a cost that could not always be calculated in advance. What made a woman politically dangerous was rarely what she did. It was what she represented. A queen consort from a foreign dynasty carried the interests of that dynasty in her bloodstream, and when the political alliance that had produced her marriage began to fray, when the treaty aged, when the balance of power shifted, when an heir was needed and had not arrived, she stopped being a symbol of connection and became a symbol of complication. Her foreignness, which had once been her value, became her liability. The very thing that had made her useful made her suspect. Consider what this looked like in practice. A noblewoman arrives at a foreign court at 17. She is received warmly. Her household is generous. She is introduced to the court's rituals, its hierarchies, its unspoken rules. She learns. She adapts. She perhaps comes to love some of what she finds there. 10 years pass. 15. The political climate that produced her marriage has shifted. The ruler she was sent to serve has new advisors, new pressures, new needs. And the woman, who has spent a decade building a life inside this institution, finds that the institution has quietly revised its opinion of her, not because she has changed, because the calculation has changed. And she is still inside it, behind a door that no longer opens from her side. Historians examining the court records of several European and Asian dynasties have noted this pattern with uncomfortable regularity. When a ruler's political position weakened, one of the first moves made by his advisors, sometimes the ruler himself, was to re-examine the loyalties of the women in his immediate circle. Not because those women had done anything, because they were there, they were connected, and they were, in the language of the time, manageable. The mechanism was almost always the same, and it is worth describing in detail because the details are what make it real. It began with a question about loyalty. The question was rarely asked directly. It was introduced obliquely, through rumor, through the testimony of a servant who had been given reasons to speak, through the sudden discovery of a letter whose meaning could be interpreted more than one way. An investigation would be opened, not loudly, with the methodical quietness of an institution that had done this before and expected to do it again. Then came the reclassification. She was no longer simply the queen, the consort, the favored companion. She was now the subject of an inquiry. The language of the documents shifted. Her name appeared with new modifiers. The records from several Tudor-era legal proceedings show how rapidly and completely the official description of a woman could change once a formal charge had been introduced. Not because the facts of her life had changed, but because the framework through which those facts were read had been replaced entirely. The same behaviors described as queenly dignity were now described as coldness or pride. The same correspondence that had been evidence of a good family connection was now evidence of divided loyalty. This is the moment the story always passes through, and it is the moment that should make us pause. Because what we are looking at is not chaos. It is not passion or rage or the erratic cruelty of a single bad man. It is a system. It is paperwork. It is procedure. People sat at desks and copied documents and stamped records and passed folders from one room to another. And at the end of this entirely legible bureaucratic process, a woman's life had been converted into a problem with a solution. The solution had a name, and the name was always given in calm, measured language. Let us speak plainly about what these solutions look like. In some cases, the solution was confinement. A woman who had moved freely through a palace found that her movement was gradually, then completely, restricted. She was told this was for her protection. The rooms she was given were comfortable, sometimes lavishly appointed, but the door, when tested, opened only from the outside. The windows looked onto enclosed gardens. The servants assigned to her reported, as servants in such arrangements always reported, to someone else. Surviving accounts, letters smuggled out through laundresses, messages embedded in embroidery patterns, fragments quoted in the memoirs of foreign ambassadors who visited and later described what they had seen, suggest that the women in these situations understood exactly what had happened. The confinement was not incidental, it was the point. In other cases, the solution was a trial. Trials leave records, and records, even when written by hostile hands, carry information between their lines. The charges brought against women in politically motivated proceedings followed patterns that a modern reader can identify almost immediately. Accusations of infidelity that could not be independently verified. Allegations of conspiracy that rested on the testimony of individuals who had been offered inducements to testify. Suggestions of spiritual or moral disorder that were impossible to disprove because they were impossible to prove. The accused was rarely permitted to speak in her own defense in any meaningful way. The outcome of the trial, in many cases, had been determined before the trial began. What happened after is not always fully recorded. The documents sometimes use the word removed, sometimes transferred, sometimes dealt with according to the law, a phrase so smoothed by official usage that it carries no friction at all, nothing to catch on, nothing to hold. The ledger moves on to the next entry. But let us not move on quite yet, because the ledger is exactly what demands our attention. One of the most revealing aspects of these cases is not the violence, where it occurred, but the administrative thoroughness that surrounded it. Records were kept, names were written down, and then, in many instances, those names were written over. The woman who had been a queen was retroactively demoted in official genealogies. The woman who had been a consort was erased from state portraits, her figure painted out and replaced with decorative pattern, or simply left as a gap in the composition that no one was supposed to notice. Later chronicles describe the period of her presence in the most minimal possible terms: a tenure, a marriage, a name that appeared briefly and then was resolved. That word, resolved, appears more than once in documents from different traditions, different centuries, different hemispheres. Its repetition is not coincidental. What was being managed was not primarily a person. It was a narrative. The institution, the court, the dynasty, the church, the state, had a story it needed to tell about itself, and the woman had become an inconvenient chapter. The solution was editorial as much as it was anything else. This is the point where you might think, surely this was an exception. Surely this was the behavior of a particularly ruthless individual, a particularly barbaric era, a particularly broken institution. It was not an exception. Across the centuries and across the continents, the machinery operated with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The specific methods differed. The justifications differed. The vocabulary differed enormously. But the underlying structure, a woman who had served a political function, who had become a political problem, who was then subjected to a formal process that converted her from a person into a resolution. This structure repeated, and repeated, and repeated again. What we are looking at is not a series of individual failures. It is a feature. The historical record offers us many cases. For this account, we turn to one of the most thoroughly documented, the Ottoman imperial household of the 16th and 17th centuries. The scholar Leslie Peirce spent years in Ottoman archives, reconstructing the lives of women whose names had been reduced to titles in official chronicles. What she found was a system of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary containment. Consider a woman we will call Fatma Hatun, a composite drawn from documented patterns in the archival record. She enters the imperial household as a young woman, likely purchased or captured, and then educated within the palace system itself. She learns the language of the court, its music, its protocol. She advances through the household hierarchy. If she bears a son, and the son survives, her position transforms entirely. She becomes the mother of a potential sultan. She is given her own staff, her own budget, her own correspondence channels. Venetian diplomatic reports from this period describe women in exactly this position, with a mixture of admiration and barely concealed alarm. They negotiated. They strategized. They occasionally issued what amounted to direct orders to men who held formal titles of state. The door to the inner circle had opened wide. Then the Sultan died, or a rival son ascended. The transition could take hours. The same household that had deferred to her the previous morning was reorganized by evening. The correspondence channels were redirected. The staff was replaced. A document was drawn up, politely worded, formally structured, indicating that she would be relocating to the old palace. The old palace, it should be noted, was not a prison in the architectural sense. It had gardens. It had servants. It had, by most accounts, adequate provisions. What it did not have was a door that led back to where she had been. Later Ottoman chronicles record the fates of such women in entries of 3 or 4 words. Transferred to the old palace. Married to the governor of such and such a province. Deceased. The compression is total. An entire life, decades of accumulated knowledge, relationship, influence, reduced to a single line in an administrative register. The remaining space on the page was given to other matters. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows these women through the archive. It is not the silence of absence. There are records. There are always records. But the records were written by people with interests, and those interests did not include preserving the full complexity of these women's inner lives. What survives is almost entirely mediated, filtered through male chroniclers, foreign observers, hostile successors, institutional scribes whose job was to record outcomes rather than experiences. Something slips through occasionally. A fragment of a letter, preserved inside a later diplomatic dispatch because someone found its phrasing curious, in which a woman describes her new accommodation in language whose surface is calm and whose undertone, if read carefully, is not. A marginal notation in a monastery's account book, written in a different hand from the main text, crowded into the left margin as though added quickly, that gives a personal name where the official record gives only a category. One woman, foreign origin, placed here by order. A series of marks carved into the plastered wall of an interior room in a former palace complex, documented by conservators in the 1990s and not yet fully catalogued. The marks are small. They were placed at a height consistent with someone seated. They are not decorative. These are not proof of anything specific, but they are evidence of something the official record was not designed to preserve. The fact that the women inside these systems were watching what happened to them and, in the margins, leaving a record of their own. The damage did not stop with the woman herself. The political liability of women connected to rulers extended into the generation that followed. A son born to a woman who had been disgraced carried the weight of that disgrace into his own political prospects. A daughter whose mother had been accused, whether or not the accusation had been substantiated, and in many cases there was nothing to substantiate, found that her entire value in the political economy of alliance had been compromised by an event she had not witnessed and could not answer for. This is how the liability compounded. The system punished not just the woman, but the network of relationships she represented. Her children, her siblings still in the court of origin, her family's capacity to negotiate future alliances. A single removal could, if the woman had been sufficiently central, destabilize an entire web of political connections that had taken years to construct. The precision of this is worth sitting with. The woman who had been made into an asset because of her network was, when she became a liability, disposed of in a way that also destroyed the network. The tool and the threat were dismantled in the same motion. The institution moved forward largely intact, carrying a small amendment in its records and the closed door of what had once been her household behind it. Somewhere in a provincial record office, not the capital, not the central archive, but a secondary repository in a smaller city, a later ledger lists her children's names under a column headed Status Uncertain. A single line. The column next to it is blank. The erasure was not always complete. History is a leaky vessel, and things fall through. A name struck from an official genealogy survived in a local parish record 300 miles from the capital, written down by a priest not for political reasons, but simply because it was the name of someone who had passed through his village and left an impression. A portrait altered in the 16th century, the central figure's face repainted with a different face, as documented in several cases from early modern Europe, was X-rayed by conservators in the 20th century, and the original face came back, layer by layer, in the cold light of an imaging machine that had no interest in the politics of a dynasty long dissolved. An architectural survey of a wing of a former imperial complex in Central Asia, conducted in the 1970s and published in a journal that very few people read, noted inscriptions on an interior wall predating the official renovation of that space by approximately 200 years. The inscriptions were in a script that had fallen out of common use. They had not been translated as of the survey's publication date. The survey noted their existence and moved on. We do not know what they say, but they are there. The door to that room is still there too, hinged differently than the surrounding architecture, as though it was added later, or altered, or once led somewhere it no longer leads. This is the thing about erasure. It is never total. The institution believes it has closed the account, but accounts reopen. Documents surface in private collections when estates are settled. Letters found in the lining of trunks. Court records from peripheral jurisdictions that never entered the Central Archive and were therefore never subjected to the Central Archive's editorial decisions. The women who were converted into line items have a habit, across the centuries, of reasserting their complexity. There is something else worth naming, and it is perhaps the hardest part of the history to sit with. The women who entered these systems were not, in most cases, naive. They came from families that had been navigating political institutions for generations. They understood, at some level, the terms of the exchange being made when they were positioned as assets. They understood that their value was contingent, that the alliance they embodied could be renegotiated, that the protection they were offered came with conditions attached. They entered anyway, because they had no alternative, or because the alternative was worse, or because the system had been so thoroughly normalized by the culture they inhabited that the understanding remained partial, theoretical, something that happened to others. The women who were used and discarded were surrounded by people, including other women, who accepted the framework without necessarily accepting what it did to specific individuals. The lady-in-waiting who reported to the new household, the sister who wrote letters home that were careful not to contain anything useful to the accused, the daughter who remarried quickly and completely revised her public memory of her mother. These were not monsters. They were people navigating the same system from slightly more favorable positions within it, and they made choices accordingly. The institution did not require monsters. It required participation. And participation, when normalized, does not feel like complicity. It feels like ordinary life. It feels like keeping your own door open by not asking too many questions about the one that just closed. The ledger, at the end of all of this, is what remains. Not the woman, not the full account of what she knew, or what she understood, or what she tried to say in the limited ways available to her. The ledger, a line of text that gives her name, a date, a disposition. Transferred, resolved, removed to a suitable establishment. The language is so smooth it almost slides past without friction. That is the point of the language. That is what the language was designed to do. Even the ledger, if you read it carefully, if you notice the handwriting that changes mid-entry, the date that does not quite match the date in the parallel document, the name that appears misspelled in one record and not another, as if copied from a source that itself contained an error. Even the ledger opens, slightly, onto something it was not designed to show. A gap, a moment of hesitation, a trace of the person who was being converted into an entry and who, for 1 second, was still a person. Archaeologists and archivists in the 21st century have developed techniques for reading documents that have been deliberately obscured. Ultraviolet light, chemical treatment, digital enhancement of faded ink. What they find, with some regularity, is that what was crossed out is often the most important text on the page. The institution wrote over itself. Under the writing, the original is still there, waiting. The question this history leaves is not only about the past. It is about the structure, about what it means for a system to convert people into functions, and what it means for those inside the system to participate in that conversion without recognizing it as such. About the distance between the language used to describe a process and what the process actually does to the person it is applied to. That distance has not disappeared. It has changed its vocabulary. The doors look different now. The ledgers are kept in different formats. They are still very clean. And somewhere, in a margin no one has thought to examine, a name is still there.